You've given us a collection of news articles, live updates, even some election coverage, all centered around the Israel-Hamas conflict and Iran's involvement.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely.
Yeah,
A complex situation with many moving parts, but I'm ready to dig in if you are.
absolutely. The human cost of this conflict is already immense, and the potential for wider regional destabilization is a very grave concern.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
Yeah.
So to make sure we're both on the same page, it seems you're particularly interested in getting beyond the headlines and really understanding the geopolitical chess game at play here.
Right. We need to carefully dissect these sources, consider the different perspectives presented, understand the motivations of all the key players involved.
Okay, so let's dive in. One thing that immediately jumps out from these sources is Egypt's proposal for a 2-day ceasefire, potentially paving the way for the release of 4 hostages.
Yeah, that's a significant development. It suggests a potential for at least a temporary reprieve in the fighting.
And some breathing room for those desperately needed humanitarian aid deliveries.
Exactly. But achieving a lasting ceasefire? Well, that's going to be much more challenging.
The sources seem to suggest that the negotiations are already hitting some major roadblocks,
Yeah, Hamas is demanding a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza.
while Netanyahu, on the other hand, seems determined to stay until Hamas is completely destroyed.
It's a classic deadlock. Two sides with seemingly irreconcilable positions. And that makes the work of mediators like Egypt and Qatar incredibly difficult.
It's interesting, though, that the sources also mentioned the involvement of the U.S. in these negotiations. Even the CIA chief is reportedly involved.
Yeah, the U.S. has historically played a key role in trying to broker peace in the Middle East. Their presence underscores just how high the stakes are in this conflict.
And how much the international community is worried about the potential for this to spiral out of control.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, another development that really caught my eye was Israel's direct attacks on Iranian military bases.
Yeah, that seems like a major escalation of the conflict.
Israel is clearly responding to what they see as Iran's support for Hamas and Hezbollah.
And potentially trying to cripple Iran's nuclear and missile program.
Exactly. The sources indicate that the specific Iranian bases targeted are believed to be linked to these programs.
And the satellite imagery we've seen shows pretty extensive damage to these facilities.
There are even reports of casualties, both military personnel and, unfortunately, civilians.
This brings up a really critical point. The potential for unintended consequences and collateral damage in a conflict like this.
Absolutely. Strikes of this magnitude are almost guaranteed to result in civilian casualties, which then further fuel the cycle of violence and resentment.
Now, one thing I found interesting was Iran's response, or at least the response voiced by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It seems surprisingly measured given the circumstances.
Yeah, he's downplaying the attacks, urging restraint. This measured response is likely a calculated move.
You think they're worried about triggering an even bigger conflict?
I think that's definitely a factor. They have to weigh the potential costs of a full-blown war with Israel.
And they also have to consider the role of their regional proxies, like Hezbollah.
Right. How much are they willing to risk a wider proxy war engulfing the entire region? These are the kinds of questions they're grappling with right now.
It feels like the whole region is teetering on the edge of a much larger conflict.
Yeah. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of this crisis, the devastating impact it's having on civilians, particularly in Gaza.
The situation there sounds absolutely horrific.
It is. Reports from northern Gaza are describing just harrowing levels of death and destruction as a result of the Israeli offensive.
The numbers are just staggering. The Gaza Health Ministry is reporting over 42,000 Palestinians killed, with more than half of them being women and children.
It's a humanitarian catastrophe. Aid groups are warning that the situation is becoming increasingly desperate, with limited access to basic necessities and hospitals completely overwhelmed.
And we can't forget about the situation in Lebanon either. They're being pulled further and further into this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
Those Israeli strikes in Sidon, for example, resulted in 8 fatalities and 25 injuries. And the rising tensions there add another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
It's just a grim picture all around. And with the U.S. presidential election just days away, I can't help but wonder how all of this might impact the campaign and the potential for future U.S. involvement.
Yeah, that's another layer to this whole thing. Both Trump and Harris are having to address this escalating crisis, but their approaches are likely to be very different.
And those differences could have major implications for U.S. policy in the region and its role as a potential mediator.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Something we'll definitely have to keep a close eye on.
So as you can see, the situation is just incredibly complex with so many factors at play and so many potential consequences.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, and it's going to require careful analysis and a willingness to consider all sides if we're going to make any sense of it.
And on that note, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to delve even deeper into this conflict.
We'll explore the historical context that has led us to this point and try to understand the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the rise of Hamas and Hezbollah.
Stay tuned for more.
Welcome back. As promised, we're diving deeper into the historical context surrounding this conflict.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day headlines. But to really grasp the complexities we see playing out today, I think it's crucial to understand the historical roots of this conflict.
Absolutely. This isn't something that emerged overnight. This conflict is rooted in decades, even centuries, of historical grievances, political maneuvering, and competing claims to this land.
So where do we even begin?
Well, for you to really understand the current crisis, we need to go back to the very beginning, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948.
Right, and the subsequent displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
Exactly. An event known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, in the Palestinian narrative.
That event really set the stage for the decades of conflict that followed. Multiple wars, failed peace negotiations, a cycle of violence that seems to have no end.
And to fully grasp the Palestinian perspective, we also need to understand their view of the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza.
They see these as symbols of oppression, right?
Exactly, fueling resentment and resistance against Israel.
Now, from Israel's perspective, security concerns are paramount. They point to the history of attacks against them and the need to defend their citizens from groups like Hamas.
Which they designate as a terrorist organization.
Right. It's this clash of narratives, of deeply held beliefs and historical traumas that makes finding a solution so challenging.
Each side feels they are in the right, that their claims are legitimate, and that any compromise represents a betrayal of their history and their people.
And then you have the emergence of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which add another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. Hamas, which controls Gaza, arose in the 1980s as an Islamist movement dedicated to the liberation of Palestine.
And Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, emerged around the same time.
Right, with strong ties to Iran and a focus on resisting Israeli influence in the region.
Both groups have been involved in numerous attacks on Israel, further fueling that cycle of violence and deepening the mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians.
But what's crucial to understand here is that these groups are not monolithic entities.
Meaning?
Within Hamas and Hezbollah, you have different factions with varying degrees of willingness to engage in dialogue and compromise.
So it's not as simple as just saying Hamas wants this or Hezbollah wants that.
Exactly. This internal fragmentation makes negotiations even more difficult because any agreement reached may not be universally accepted within these organizations.
And of course, we can't forget the role of regional and global powers, all with their own interests and agendas.
The Middle East has long been a geopolitical chessboard with countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia all vying for influence.
So how do these outside players factor into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, each of them has a stake in the conflict, often supporting different sides and using the conflict to advance their own strategic objectives.
The United States, for example, has traditionally been a strong ally of Israel,
providing them with significant military and financial aid.
But even that relationship has become more strained in recent years.
Particularly during the Trump administration, which took a more hardline stance towards Iran and the Palestinians.
And now with the U.S. election just days away,
the outcome could have significant implications for the entire region.
A Trump victory might signal a continuation of his policies,
while a Harris administration could potentially take a different approach.
It's still too early to say with any certainty what direction a new administration would take.
Right. But it's something we'll definitely be watching closely.
So with all this historical baggage and geopolitical maneuvering, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and pessimistic about the prospects for peace.
It's certainly a daunting situation, but it's important not to succumb to despair. There have been moments in the past when progress towards peace seemed possible.
And even though those efforts ultimately failed,
they provide valuable lessons for future negotiations.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that despite the decades of conflict, there are still individuals and organizations on both sides working tirelessly to promote dialogue, understanding, and peaceful coexistence.
Their efforts may not always make headlines,
but they represent a vital source of hope for a better future.
The key takeaway for you is this. Understanding the complexities of this conflict is essential for informed engagement.
There are no easy answers, no quick fixes.
But by delving deeper into the historical context, the political dynamics, and the human stories, we can begin to grasp the nuances of this seemingly intractable situation.
And consider the difficult choices that lie ahead.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look at the specific events that have led to the current escalation, beginning with Hamas's attack on southern Israel on October 7th of last year.
That attack, which resulted in the deaths of around 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, and the capture of around 250 hostages, was a major turning point in this conflict.
It shattered any remaining illusion of a peaceful resolution and unleashed a wave of anger and fear in Israel.
Leading to those calls for a decisive response against Hamas.
And Israel's retaliation was swift and devastating. A massive air and ground offensive that has resulted in the deaths of over 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza.
And while Israel claims to be targeting militants,
It's clear that the vast majority of casualties are civilians, including a disproportionate number of women and children.
this raises serious concerns about the proportionality of the response and potential violations of international humanitarian law,
And then to make matters even worse, we have the direct involvement of Iran,
which has historically supported Hamas and Hezbollah.
but until now had not been directly targeted by Israel,
Israel's strikes on Iranian military bases mark a significant escalation of the conflict.
raising the specter of a wider regional war.
And while Iran has so far responded with restraint,
There are fears that they could retaliate through their proxies, like Hezbollah in Lebanon.
further widening the conflict and increasing the risk of a catastrophic confrontation between Israel and Iran.
The situation is incredibly volatile, with each action and reaction pushing the region closer to the brink.
The stakes are incredibly high.
And the potential consequences of a full-blown regional war are almost too horrific to contemplate.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential scenarios that could unfold in the coming weeks and months?
Well, that's a question we'll explore in our final segment. We'll examine the various factors that could influence the trajectory of the conflict, from the ongoing ceasefire efforts and hostage negotiations to the upcoming U.S. election and the potential for international intervention.
We'll also look at the possible long-term consequences of this conflict, not just for the region, but for the world as a whole.
So stay tuned for our final segment where we'll try to make sense of this complex and ever-evolving situation and consider the difficult choices that lie ahead.
Welcome back to our final segment. You ready to explore those potential scenarios and the long-term consequences of this conflict?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in.
Okay, so one of the most immediate factors influencing the situation right now has to be those ceasefire efforts and the ongoing hostage negotiations.
Right. Egypt's proposal for a 2-day ceasefire with the release of those 4 hostages, it's a step in the right direction, but
But our sources do highlight a long history of stalled negotiations.
exactly. And it comes back to that fundamental disagreement between the two sides.
Hamas wants a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza.
While Netanyahu insists on staying until Hamas is destroyed.
Two completely opposing positions, making a lasting solution seem almost impossible.
Yeah. So given that, what are some of the possible outcomes here?
Right. What are the potential scenarios we're looking at?
Well, one possibility is that we see a short-term ceasefire similar to what Egypt has proposed.
It would provide a temporary reprieve.
Exactly. Some breathing room for those humanitarian aid deliveries and a chance to secure the release of at least some of those hostages.
Sounds like a positive step.
But it wouldn't address the underlying issues that are fueling this conflict.
And without a real shift in the positions of both sides.
Any short-term ceasefire is likely to be fragile and could easily collapse.
So what's the alternative?
Well, the other scenario we have to consider, and it's a much more worrying one, is a complete breakdown of negotiations.
Leading to?
An intensification of the conflict, potentially even drawing in regional players like Iran and Hezbollah more directly.
That's a terrifying thought.
It would be catastrophic. A wider regional war involving Iran and Hezbollah.
The consequences don't bear thinking about.
Not just for the countries directly involved, or for the entire global community.
Imagine the impact on global oil prices.
Exactly. This isn't just some distant war. The economic consequences could be felt by all of us.
And we can't forget about the U.S. election just days away.
Right. Our sources suggest that Trump and Harris have very different approaches to the Middle East.
Trump's stance towards Iran and the Palestinians has been much more hardline.
Whereas Harris is seen as more supportive of a two-state solution and a diplomatic approach.
So the election's outcome could have a huge influence on U.S. policy in the region.
It could either help to de-escalate the conflict or potentially exacerbate tensions even further.
So as we can see, the range of potential scenarios is pretty wide, from a fragile peace to a catastrophic regional war.
And it's hard to predict which way things will go.
So regardless of which path this conflict takes, What are some of the long-term consequences we can expect to see?
Well, first and foremost, the human toll is going to be immense.
Tens of thousands have already been killed.
Millions more displaced from their homes.
The trauma of this conflict is going to impact generations to come.
Absolutely. And the economic cost is staggering, too.
Gaza's infrastructure has been decimated.
The Israeli economy is also feeling the effects of the ongoing violence and instability.
And politically,
This conflict has further eroded trust between Israelis and Palestinians.
making the prospect of a two-state solution seem even more distant.
It's also fueled extremism and radicalization on both sides.
Making it harder to find those moderate voices who are willing to engage in dialogue and compromise.
And on a global scale, this conflict has the potential to further destabilize the entire Middle East.
A region already grappling with so much political instability, sectarian violence, and economic hardship.
It's also diverted international attention and resources away from other pressing global issues.
Like climate change, poverty, global health crises.
It's a tragedy on so many levels.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this complex and challenging situation.
We've explored the historical context, the key players, the current crisis, and the range of potential scenarios that might unfold.
We've also examined the long-term consequences of this conflict, both for the region and for the world as a whole.
And while the situation remains incredibly uncertain, one thing is clear.
The need for a peaceful resolution is more urgent than ever.
We encourage you to stay engaged with this issue, to seek out diverse perspectives, to challenge your own assumptions, and to advocate for a just and lasting peace.
The future of the Middle East, and indeed, the world, may very well depend on it.